Welcome to the mysterious casebook. Tonight, we walk with Miss Marple through the lilac-scented hush of Gossington. A housekeeper's gentle memory hides a cruel deception. Where are you joining us from tonight? Draw the curtains close and let the mystery begin. The air in St. Mary Mead that morning was as still and mild as freshly ironed linen. The village dozed beneath a pale April sun, its quiet disturbed only by the postman's bicycle bell and the faint clinking of teacups within the vicarage garden. It was, in every outward respect, an ordinary Thursday day for polishing silver, hanging out the washing and remarking that the weather was holding nicely. Yet, like the hush before a confession, something seemed faintly amiss. It wasn't the air, though it smelled unusually sweet, nor the bird-song, though it faltered oddly near the lane by Old Hall. It was, rather, the lilacs blooming too early, too bright, and far too thickly around the late Mrs. Partridge's cottage. Mrs. Partridge had been the housekeeper at Old Hall for nearly 40 years, a small, neat woman with a spine like a knitting needle and an air of perpetual respectability. She had died, most said, of a weak heart and a strong sense of duty collapsing, mop in hand, in the West Wing corridor some 3 weeks before. Her funeral, though modest, had drawn half the parish, for though she was not much loved, she was greatly depended upon, and her passing had left the great house rather unmoored. Miss Marple, sitting near the vicarage window with her embroidery, noticed the unusual fragrance long before anyone else mentioned it. The lilacs, she reflected, had always been Mrs. Partridge's pride trimmed to symmetry, fed with ash and bone dust, and never allowed to droop. That they now grew wild, almost untamed in their abundance, seemed somehow inappropriate. Nature has a curious sense of timing, she murmured, threading her needle, especially where death has recently been. By 11 o'clock, the matter had entered the gossip circuit. Mrs. Price Ridley, standing near the greengrocer's counter, declared that the smell was positively indecent, as though the late housekeeper's spirit were parading itself through the village. Miss Hartnell, who had always suspected Mrs. Partridge of pilfering the hall's best brandy, countered that lilacs fed on guilt bloomed most violently. And Mr. Archer, the undertaker, nodded gravely from behind his spectacles, saying he'd never known lilacs to take so well to disturbed soil. By noon, the talk had reached Miss Marple in the form of a delicate remark from the vicar's wife, who arrived at the cottage with a basket of scones. "It's extraordinary, Jane," said Mrs. Clement, setting down her basket. "The scent carries all the way to the lich gate. Poor Mrs. Partridge would have hated such a display. She always said too much bloom was vulgar." "Indeed," said Miss Marple mildly. "Excess in any form usually hints at imbalance. I wonder, though, has anyone been to tidy her garden since?" "Oh, yes. Young Tommy Pierce was sent by the hall to see to it. He came back as a rather shaken, poor boy. Said the soil felt strange underfoot, loose, as though someone had been digging. But I dare say he imagined it." "Boys do?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, indeed. Boys and sometimes Providence have the oddest way of noticing what others overlook." At 2:30, a light drizzle began to fall, and with it came Constable Ames, sheltering beneath his mackintosh, looking faintly apologetic. He had known Miss Marple for years and always found her presence faintly disconcerting, as though she saw through his uniform to the schoolboy underneath. "Afternoon, ma'am," he began, removing his cap. "I just came from Old Hall. Mrs. Bantry sent for the inspector something about a matter in the late housekeeper's garden." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly, laying her embroidery aside. "The lilacs again?" Ames hesitated, in a manner of speaking. Seems Tommy Pierce wasn't imagining things after all. They've found a bit of cloth old black serge, like part of a uniform buried just by the lilac hedge. And, well, something else. A woman's brooch, bent and missing its pin. It looked rather like one Mrs. Partridge used to wear it. There was a pause. The rain ticked faintly on the window pane. "How curious," murmured Miss Marple. Lilacs and secrets both have a way of thriving underground. She rose, smoothing her skirt. You may tell Mrs. Bantry I'll stroll by presently. It's been too long since I visited her garden. By the time she reached Old Hall, the drizzle had thickened to mist, and the lilacs loomed like pale ghosts along the hedge. Two constables stood awkwardly near the flower bed, their boots half sunk in the churned soil. Mrs. Bantry herself hovered nearby in an oilskin coat, visibly torn between excitement and horror. "Jane, my dear," she called as Miss Marple approached. "You've come at such a moment. They've found something dreadful. I can't make head or tail of it. Poor Mrs. Partridge, and to think she worked here all those years." Miss Marple's eyes moved gently from the trampled lawn to the upturned soil, and then to the heap of lilac branches stacked carelessly on the path. A faint, sweet scent hung over everything, not the innocent fragrance of spring, but something denser, almost cloying. "Flowers," she said softly, "do tell their own stories if one only listens to the silence between the petals." Mrs. Bantry blinked. "My dear Jane, you're as mysterious as ever. What do you mean?" Miss Marple's gaze rested on the bent brooch lying upon a folded cloth near the constable's notebook. "Only that some roots grow stronger when they've been watered by lies," she said gently. In the distance, a rook cawed once over the churchyard. The sound fell like a small punctuation mark on the afternoon stillness, as though the village itself were taking a breath before the first true whisper began. The rook's cry had scarcely faded before the village began to hum with speculation. At first, it moved quietly like wind stirring through curtains before spreading, thread by thread, from parlor to parlor, until St. Mary Mead was woven in murmurs. No one could agree precisely what had been found in the lilac bed, but everyone agreed it was dreadful, and that it would not have happened in the old days, when Mrs. Partridge herself kept the hall in morale as well as domestic order. By tea-time, Miss Hartnell was certain the police had exhumed a skeleton, no doubt that of a soldier gone missing after the war, while Mrs. Price Ridley maintained that it was simply a matter of stolen jewelry and common servants' jealousy. At the grocer's counter, Mrs. Bantry's maid, breathless from errands, whispered that the late housekeeper had been accused of hoarding money not her own. By the time evening came, rumor had flowered into full scandal, scenting every doorstep. Miss Marple, however, had heard little that was new. She had taken tea with Mrs. Bantry in the drawing-room after the constables left, and though the talk had been half in gasps, half in reminiscence, Miss Marple's eyes had wandered again and again toward the window where the lilacs drooped, violet and white, against the mist. "You see, Jane," Mrs. Bantry had said, lowering her voice, "I can't bear to think she might have been involved in anything unsavory. After all, she was devoted to this house." "She was devoted to something," Miss Marple replied gently. "The difficulty is always discovering to what or to whom." When she left, the sky had begun to clear, leaving the lawns wet and glistening. She walked home along the lane, her parasol closed, thinking of Mrs. Partridge's life. A woman who kept accounts with a pinched hand, who seldom smiled, who spoke of duty as though it were a heavy coat she had learned to wear with pride. Such women, Miss Marple reflected, were rarely without secrets, not scandalous necessarily, but the kind that pressed inward, shaping their faces into careful masks. Outside the church gate, she met Mr. Clement, the vicar, who was locking up after evensong. He looked thoughtful, his fingers turning the key with unnecessary precision. "Ah, Miss Marple, you've heard, I suppose," he said quietly. "Only what everyone else has heard and a little of what they have imagined," she replied. He sighed. "I can't think how such rumors begin." "They begin," she said, "as most sins do in anxiety. We dislike uncertainty, so we create our own order of guilt." The vicar smiled faintly, acknowledging her truth with a nod. "Inspector Craddock is coming down from Melchester tomorrow," he said. Mrs. Bantry sent for him directly. She was rather insistent. "Quite right of her," said Miss Marple. "He's a sensible man. He listens." "Indeed," said the vicar. "Still, I fear he'll find little enough to listen to other than talk." "Sometimes," said Miss Marple, "talk is precisely what one should listen to." They parted at the gate, and Miss Marple stood for a moment beneath the churchyard yews. The evening bell began its slow toll, deep and melancholy, as though the air itself remembered the sound of Mrs. Partridge's steps. The lilac scent drifted even here, thinner now, but persistent. It was then she noticed a figure moving near the hedge opposite the lich gate, a tall woman in a dark coat, bending as if to examine the soil near the wall. The woman straightened, looked quickly over her shoulder, and walked away toward the post road. The face, in the fading light, was that of Miss Ellery, the companion to Colonel and Mrs. Marchmont at Rose Bank, known in the village for her sharp tongue and sharper ears. Curious, thought Miss Marple. Miss Ellery had never much liked Mrs. Partridge. She had once remarked too loudly over that some servants die too conveniently. Later that night, Miss Marple sat in her armchair by the fire, the village clock chiming 10. A single candle flickered on the mantelpiece beside her knitting. She thought again of the bent brooch, the broken pin, and the scent of lilac clinging to the soil. There was, she felt, something deeply inconsistent in the story as told a fracture between the appearance of loyalty and the substance beneath. People, she mused, always die in ways that reflect their living habits. The careless fall by accident, the cautious fade quietly in their sleep, and the guilty are often tidied away by other hands. She made a small note in the margin of her gardening almanac. Lilacs root disturbance concealed movement. To anyone else, it might have seemed an observation about pruning. At that same hour, in the back room of the Blue Boar, two men sat over pints discussing the day's discoveries. One was Tommy Pierce, the gardener's boy, pale and earnest. The other was George Sims, who kept the Hall stables. "She was kind to me," said Tommy, his voice unsteady. "Used to bring me ginger biscuits on Fridays. I don't see why folks speak so ill of her." Sims gave a slow shrug. "Kind, maybe. But she knew too much. There was something about that ledger she kept locked away. I saw her take it to the post once, wrapped in brown paper, told me it was accounts for the pantry. Accounts, my foot." Tommy frowned. "Ledger? What kind?" "Old. Green leather, brass corners. She didn't want nobody seeing it. And the day before she died, I saw a gent from London come asking for her. Said he was her nephew. Only she never had any kin, not that I ever heard." Across the village, a clock struck 10:30. The voices faded into the hum of the pub. Above them, the lilacs stirred in the soft night breeze, their fragrance drifting through the open window like a secret half-remembered. And far away in her quiet cottage, Miss Marple folded her knitting and looked toward the darkened garden. Somewhere among the roses, a petal felt soundless, but certain, though time itself had just marked a turning. A faint rustle broke the silence beyond Miss Marple's garden wall. She listened, head tilted, fingers still upon the woodland, caught the soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel path. It was late for callers. Rising, she peered through the lace-curtained window and glimpsed the wavering glow of a lantern moving past the hedge. The light belonged to Constable Ames, trudging toward the vicarage. Even at a distance, his gait suggested disquiet. Miss Marple, with the unobtrusive efficiency of a woman long accustomed to emergencies that arrived wrapped in gentility, put aside her knitting and fetched her shawl. By the time she reached the lane, the air was cool and scented faintly of lilac and damp earth. Ames was speaking with the vicar under the porch lamp, his cap in his hands. "Evening, ma'am," he said as Miss Marple drew near. "Inspector Craddock sent word he'll be down first thing tomorrow, and there's more besides. Mrs. Bantry's footman swears he saw a stranger at the Hall grounds last night. said the fellow kept to the shadows and left toward the orchard wall. The vicar frowned. A prowler, you mean? Could be, said Ames. But he was no common thief. Left no prints, no sign of entry. Just watched. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the constable's face. And Mrs. Bantry's footman, he's reliable. Not precisely, ma'am. Young and partial to storytelling. But he was pale enough when he told it. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unreadable. Sometimes those who embellish truth tell more of it than they intend. The conversation dwindled, and she returned home beneath the lilac shadows, her mind quietly knitting its own patterns. The stranger, the buried brooch, the missing ledger each was a thread. Yet the village, ever concerned with propriety, would pull at the neatest thread first. Respectability had its own logic. One never suspected those whose manners were impeccable. Morning brought a washed gold sky and a sense of suspended breath. Word had spread of Inspector Craddock's impending arrival. Windows were polished, gossip rehearsed. At 10 o'clock sharp, a police motor car stopped before the hall, its polished bonnet glinting in the sun. Craddock stepped out a solid, courteous man, his eyes alert beneath the brim of his hat. He greeted Mrs. Bantry with his usual blend of deference and mild humor, yet there was an edge to his tone as he surveyed the garden. "Still smells of lilac," he remarked. "Funny thing, scent. Clings long after its cause is gone." Mrs. Bantry shivered. "It's begun to seem almost well, indecent. Poor Mrs. Partridge's ghost, I dare say." "Ghosts rarely dig holes, madam," said Craddock dryly, and crouched beside the disturbed soil. "Tell me again who found this." "Tommy Pierce," she said. "The gardener's boy." I'll want a word with him." Miss Marple, who had appeared unobtrusively at the garden gate, inclined her head. "He's a sensible boy. Afraid of being thought foolish, which often means he's noticed something important." Craddock straightened, smiling faintly. "You're here early, Miss Marple. I should have known. One can hardly avoid interest when one's friends are plagued by mysteries," she replied with perfect composure. Within the hour, Tommy Pierce stood awkwardly before them, cap in hand. His shoes were muddy, his voice trembled between eagerness and guilt. "I didn't mean to find it, sir. Just thought I'd tidy the edge, like Mrs. Bantry said." Then the spade hit something hard. Craddock nodded encouragingly. "And you saw the cloth first?" "Yes, sir. Black bit of it. It looked like an old uniform, maybe. And then the brooch rolled out when I lifted it." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "You'd known that brooch, hadn't you?" Tommy looked up quickly. "Oh, yes, ma'am. Mrs. Partridge wore it every Sunday. Silver lilac branch. She said it matched her garden." Craddock made a note. "And no one else went near the spot afterward?" "No, sir. Only me." When Tommy had been sent away, Craddock turned to Mrs. Bantry. "We'll need to search the housekeeper's room. I'm told she kept a ledger." Mrs. Bantry nodded nervously. "Top floor, west corridor. The maids have left it untouched. The room, when they entered, was neat to the point of austerity. The air smelled faintly of lavender and dust." Miss Marple's eyes roamed. The dressing table, brushes aligned, folded gloves, and a small photograph of a young maid in uniform. On the writing desk lay the ledger, green leather, brass corners dulled by age. Craddock opened it carefully. Blank pages. Every sheet had been torn out cleanly, leaving only faint impressions where the pen had once moved. Mrs. Bantry gasped. "But it was full. I saw her writing in it the day before she died." "Then someone has seen fit to remove its contents," said Craddock. "Neatly done, too. Not a scrap left." Miss Marple leaned closer, tracing a finger along the spine. "The binding's been loosened recently. See here, fresh glue residue. Whoever took the pages knew their craft. Professional, you think?" "Or practiced," she said quietly. "Servants learn more about concealment than most thieves." Her eyes flicked to the window, where the lilacs swayed gently against the light. Their color, so vivid, so persistent, seemed almost indecent beside the room's pallor. Appearance and truth, she thought again, seldom bloom from the same root. Craddock replaced the ledger and snapped his notebook shut. If the late Mrs. Partridge had secrets, they're scattered now. We'll find where. Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression mild. Oh, I dare say the village will help you, Inspector. It's very good at scattering things. Outside, a single petal drifted from the lilac hedge and landed on the gravel, a small, perfect lie pretending to be innocent. The petal's descent might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but Miss Marple's eyes followed its path as it came to rest beside a set of faint footprints on the gravel. They were narrow, not a man's, and pointed at the tower lady's outdoor shoe, likely worn for walking between garden and lane. She bent slightly, her expression unreadable, before straightening just as Inspector Craddock turned from the doorway. "I'll have these prints photographed," he said briskly, unaware of her observation. "There's something curious about how fresh they are." "Curious," Miss Marple murmured, "and inconvenient. Gardens rarely wait for permission to tell their stories." Craddock glanced at her, half amused. "I've learned that about St. Mary Mead. Nothing stays buried here for long." Miss Marple smiled faintly, but her mind was already elsewhere. The freshness of the footprints suggested a recent visitor, someone bold enough to enter the hall grounds after the discovery, but discreet enough to avoid attention. Her thoughts went to Miss Ellery, the Marchmont's companion, glimpsed by the church wall the previous evening. A woman of routines and resentments, her curiosity often wore the costume of moral concern. That afternoon, the vicar's wife called, pale with the delight of new gossip. "Jane, you won't believe what I've heard. Mrs. Marchmont's companion has been positively distraught, claims the police may question her about Mrs. Partridge. She insists she hardly knew the woman." Miss Marple poured tea with perfect calm. "I dare say she believes that," she said. "People often underestimate how well they know those they dislike." Mrs. Clement blinked. "You think she's hiding something?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that she's frightened of appearing to have known too much. It's a distinction that matters in small places like ours." Later that day, Miss Marple took her customary walk toward Rose Bank. The Marchmonts' villa sat in prim respectability behind white gates, its curtains drawn in rigid symmetry. She found Miss Ellery in the garden, clipping the last of the fading daffodils. The companion looked up sharply, then relaxed when she recognized her visitor. "Miss Marple. How kind of you to call. We've all been quite on edge since that dreadful business at the Hall. I thought a little air might do us both good," Miss Marple said, "and conversation, perhaps even better." They settled on a bench near the rose arch. Miss Ellery's hands were restless, stripping the leaves from her clippings. "Such an embarrassment," she said at last. "The police came about, asking the most peculiar questions, as though I would have anything to do with a servant's affairs." Affairs. Miss Marple's tone was mild. I hadn't heard there were any. The companion colored faintly. "I only mean she was secretive, the kind who kept letters locked away. I once saw her receive a man's handwriting from London. She tore it up at once, quite white in the face. There's something dreadful about women who have no family yet get letters from men, don't you think? Sometimes dreadful, sometimes sad," said Miss Marple. "It depends who sent them." Miss Ellery gave a small, strained laugh. "You're teasing me, Miss Marple. I'm sure it was something sordid. I told Colonel Marchmont as much." "You told him?" Miss Marple repeated gently. "Then you may have done the poor woman harm without intending it." The other woman's scissors paused mid-air. "Harm? Surely not. Colonel Marchmont is the soul of discretion." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, "but discretion often travels through the household faster than a rumor travels through the village." Miss Ellery bit her lip. then lowered her voice. "There was another thing, though I shouldn't repeat it. The day before she died, Mrs. Partridge came to see me. She said she needed advice. Imagine, as if I were a priest. She wanted to know whether a woman could be forgiven for keeping silent about a crime." Miss Marple's eyes did not move. "Did she say what kind of crime?" "No. Only that she had seen something years ago, something that had never rested right with her conscience. I told her the best forgiveness comes through confession, and she said, 'That's easy for you, who never knew temptation.' Then she left. The silence that followed was delicate as porcelain. Miss Marple took her cup, her voice soft. "We are all tempted, Miss Ellery, sometimes to sin, sometimes to self-importance. Both can be fatal in their way." The companion flushed. "You have a very odd way of comforting people, Miss Marple." "My dear," said Miss Marple kindly, "I've lived long enough to know comfort rarely helps. Clarity does." As she rose to leave, she glanced toward the flower bed beneath the window. There, half buried in soil, was the stub of a burnt envelope, its edge marked with blue sealing wax, the sort used for official correspondence. She said nothing, only bent as if admiring a tulip before taking her leave. Walking home along the lane, she reflected that Miss Ellery's unease was not entirely the fluttering of nerves. The companion had revealed too much for a woman claiming indifference, and yet there was truth in her fear, truth disguised as gossip, half digested by pride. Respectability again, performing its little mask. At the corner by the green, she paused. A child was playing with a toy spade, scooping at the earth. The soil crumbled softly under each stroke, fresh and dark. "It comes up easily after rain," the girl said to no one in particular. Miss Marple's gaze rested on the disturbed ground, the tiny imitation of the gardener's motion. She smiled faintly, but the smile faded before it reached her eyes. The earth of St. Mary Mead, she thought, had learned to give up its secrets far too easily. The child's spade struck the earth again, the faint metallic scrape echoing in Miss Marple's mind as she turned up the lane. Rain clouds were gathering low, smudging the sky into grey velvet. The air, scented with lilac and damp grass, carried that peculiar tension that seemed to precede both confession and downpour. Miss Marple walked steadily, parasol in hand, until the sound of a motor interrupted her thoughts. A sleek black Cara rare sight in St. Mary Mead was pulling up before the post office. The driver, a dark-suited man of about 50, stepped out and adjusted his hat with deliberate precision. His shoes gleamed, his manner did not. He glanced at the signboard, then at the cottages as though cataloguing their inferiority. Mrs. Weatherby, the postmistress, peered through her window, mouth half open, as he entered. Miss Marple crossed the green just in time to hear his voice, low but polished. "A telegram for Mrs. Bantry, Old Hall, immediate delivery." He paused, then added, "And perhaps you can tell me, Mrs. Weatherby, whether Mrs. Partridge once collected her correspondence here." The woman blinked. "The housekeeper from Old Hall?" "Oh, yes, sir, every Thursday without fail, until she passed, poor soul." "Why is something amiss?" He smiled, a courteous gesture that never reached his eyes. "Merely tying up loose ends." "I'm her solicitor." The words sounded rehearsed. Miss Marple, seemingly absorbed in rearranging her gloves, waited until he left the shop. Solicitors, she thought, rarely drive themselves in motor cars quite that new. The man paused upon seeing her mere flicker of polite interest, then tipped his hat. "Good afternoon, madam." "Good afternoon," said Miss Marple, with her gentlest smile. "You've come a long way for village correspondence." He hesitated, then chuckled. "Quite right. London seems like another planet after these lanes. But duty calls even in death." As he passed, she noticed the faint scent of cigar smoke, expensive and lingering, and the telltale ink stain on his cuff. A man used to write letters, but perhaps not always sign his own name. At tea that evening, the vicar and his wife joined her in the sitting room, where the rain now drummed steadily against the panes. Mrs. Clement, still flushed from errands, announced the newcomer's presence with barely contained relish. "He's staying at the Swan overnight, Mr. Grayson, from London. Claims to be Mrs. Partridge's lawyer. The whole village is in a flutter." The vicar sighed. Poor woman. Even in death, she must endure intrusion. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Intrusion can sometimes be informative, Leonard, especially when the intruder seems to know what he's looking for." Mrs. Clement leaned forward. "Do you think he's genuine, Jane?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that genuine men seldom need to declare themselves so promptly." The conversation drifted, but Miss Marple's mind continued its quiet arithmetic. A solicitor from London, a burned envelope at Rose Bank, and a ledger whose pages had vanished. Threads connecting quietly beneath the polite chatter of rain. By the next morning, Inspector Craddock had already found reason to doubt Mr. Grayson's account. No record of any such firm at the address he gave, he told Miss Marple when she stopped by the hall. "I telephoned. The clerk there swears they've never heard of him." Miss Marple's expression betrayed no triumph, only mild interest. How obliging of him to make himself known before disappearing. "He hasn't yet," said Craddock grimly. "He's still at the Swan. I'll be questioning him this afternoon." "Then you may find," she said softly, "that he came to remove something rather than to deliver it." The inspector's brows lifted. "You think he's after the ledger?" "Perhaps. Or what was once written in it. Words, after all, can be as incriminating as fingerprints." When Craddock left, Miss Marple took a slow walk toward the inn herself. She did not enter, merely paused outside beneath her umbrella, noting the gleam of the car tires, the faint traces of mud crusted on the running board. Rural mud, she thought. Collected not in London, but here likely from the Hall Drive. So he'd already been there before visiting the post office. Inside, the murmur of voices carried through the open window. Mr. Grayson was speaking to the landlord, his tone smooth as poured cream. "I'm here on behalf of the family. Sensitive matters. I'll settle my account tonight." There was the clink of a coin, heavier than ordinary silver gold, perhaps. Overcompensation was a Londoner's disease. Miss Marple turned away, heading back through the wet lanes toward her cottage. By the time she arrived, the postman was at her gate with a letter in his hand. "For you, Miss Marple. Came on the London train. No sender's name." The handwriting was angular, masculine, and faintly familiar. She opened it at once. "Madame, you appear to take an interest in matters best left alone. For your own peace, leave the lilacs to fade in their season." No signature, only the faint smell of tobacco and something metallic, as though the ink itself carried malice. Miss Marple read it twice, then placed it neatly upon the mantelpiece. The rain had ceased, leaving a hush so complete that the ticking of the clock seemed suddenly intrusive. In the garden, the lilacs shivered in the wind, scattering their petals like scraps of paper torn from an unseen ledger. The petals brushed softly against the window pane, each one sliding down the glass like a quiet thought. Miss Marple remained seated, the unsigned letter still on the mantelpiece, her expression composed but inwardly alert. Threats, she reflected, were rarely intended to frighten. They were meant to measure one's silence. She reached for her notebook and wrote, without hesitation, "Fear often arrives in neat handwriting." Moments later came a knock at the door. Constable Ames stood outside, raincoat unbuttoned, hat in hand. "Beg pardon, ma'am, but Inspector Craddock asked me to fetch you. Said you'd want to be present for the questioning." "Mr. Grayson, I presume," said Miss Marple, rising. "Quite right. I wouldn't miss it." They walked together through the damp air to the Swan. The scent of wet lilacs lingered even there, though the blossoms were a mile-away sweetness that had begun to feel intrusive, almost cloying. The inn's parlor smelled of coal smoke and freshly scrubbed wood, and Mr. Grayson stood near the hearth, immaculate as before. Inspector Craddock faced him across a small table, hands clasped behind his back. "I'm afraid," Craddock was saying, "that your credentials don't seem to exist. Would you care to explain?" Grayson's smile remained courteous, but the faint pulse in his temple betrayed him. A misunderstanding, surely. "My firm was recently reorganized under another name." "Convenient timing," Craddock replied. "And what business had you had with the late Mrs. Partridge?" "She was an old client. Domestic legalities, pension, savings, the like, which required visiting her garden at midnight." Craddock's tone had cooled to steel. "Because your shoes, sir, show the same clay we've just lifted from the hall's lilac bed." For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then Grayson gave a short laugh, the sound brittle as breaking china. "Inspector, I believe you're accustomed to criminals of a more melodramatic stripe. I came to pay my respects, nothing more." Miss Marple stepped forward, mildly herself. "One does wonder, Mr. Grayson, why a man of your standing would write to an old servant at all. Few solicitors bother with sentiment." His eyes flicked toward her, and something like recognition passed there, uneasy and sharp. "Mrs. Partridge and I shared a long acquaintance. She performed a service for my firm many years ago." "What sort of service?" Craddock asked. "Clerical, nothing more." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the mirror above the mantel, a large dark glass reflecting the room. The figure of Mr. Grayson shimmered within it, his posture perfect, yet his reflection's hand moved a fraction too soon as he lifted his cup. "Mirrors do lie, don't they?" she murmured absently. Grayson's head turned sharply. "I beg your pardon." "Only that they often show more than the eye intends," said Miss Marple with her gentle smile. Craddock resumed his questioning, but the man grew increasingly guarded. At last he produced a visiting card and laid it on the table. "You may confirm my identity, Inspector. I shan't be detained further." When he had gone, hat low, shoulders tight, Craddock exhaled. "Well, he's no solicitor. I'll wager half my pension on that." Miss Marple nodded. "And yet he may still have told a fragment of truth. Clerical work, yes, but not in any office. Perhaps in a household." "You mean Mrs. Partridge worked for him?" "Or rather," she said softly, "against him once upon a time." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took her customary seat in the vicarage garden. Mrs. Clement joined her, knitting in hand. "They say the man's leaving tonight. The landlord saw him packing. I must say it's all very unsettling." Miss Marple's eyes were on the clouds reflected in her teacup. Unsettling, yes. But sometimes a departure is as revealing as an arrival. People tend to tidy their affairs before fleeing. Mrs. Clement smiled uneasily. "You sound as though you expect another tragedy." "My dear," said Miss Marple, "in villages such as ours, tragedies don't come singly. They have cousins." She rose soon after, walking toward Old Hall once more. The great house loomed pale against the deepening sky, its windows glimmering faintly like eyes half closed in sleep. Inside, Constable Ames was on duty, polishing his buttons with excessive diligence. "Inspector's gone to Melchester, ma'am. He'll be back in the morning." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Then perhaps I might look again at the housekeeper's room. It helps to sit among other people's silences." He hesitated, then nodded. "If you're careful, ma'am." The room was as she remembered, neat, airless, and waiting. She opened the small wardrobe, finding the familiar scent of starch and soap. Beneath the folded aprons lay a box of sewing materials, a Bible, and a small framed photograph. Mrs. Partridge standing beside a group of uniformed men, all nameless. One face, however, stood out, the younger version of Mr. Grayson, unmistakable even without the polish of his London attire. Miss Marple held the photograph for a long while. "So," she whispered, "our solicitor once wore a uniform." Outside the window, the lilacs swayed restlessly, their reflection caught in the mirror above the bed. For a moment, she thought she saw a second shadow there fall, motionless, yet when she turned, the doorway was empty. She placed the photograph carefully back where it belonged, her fingertips lingering on the frame. Secrets, she reflected, had a way of pressing through their disguises, like damp through old plaster. Respectability was only the first layer of paint. As she stepped into the corridor, a voice called from below, "Miss Marple." Letter for the inspector delivered by hand. Just now. Ames's voice carried up the stairwell. She descended to find him holding a brown envelope, damp at the edges. The note inside bore only a single line. "There will be another death before dawn." Miss Marple looked up slowly. The mirror in the hall caught her reflection, small, calm, unflinching, while the lilac shadows beyond the window darkened into night. The words lay stark upon the page, their ink glistening faintly under the gaslight. Miss Marple read them once, then again, as Constable Ames shifted uneasily beside her. "You think it's a prank, ma'am?" he asked, though his voice lacked conviction. "Pranks seldom come sealed and hand-delivered," she said quietly, "and never so well timed." She folded the note, slid it into its envelope, and turned toward the window. Beyond the glass, the village slept beneath a thin mist. Only the lilacs seemed awake, restless shadows, trembling in the windless night. "You'd best keep someone posted at the Swan," she added. "Mr. Grayson may be a guest of short duration." Ames nodded and hurried out, boots striking the flagstones. Miss Marple remained still, her eyes reflecting the faint gleam of the hall mirror. The notion of another death did not frighten her, it saddened her. Murder, she often thought, was never born of wickedness alone, but of desperation, vanity, and the quiet terror of exposure. And somewhere in that tangle, the truth waited. She stayed the night at Old Hall by Mrs. Bantry's insistence. "You can't possibly go back alone," her friend had declared, wrapping her in shawls and affection. "Besides, Leonard will only worry if I let you wander after letters like that." So Miss Marple slept and pretended to be in the small guest room overlooking the drive. Moonlight filtered through thin curtains, casting silver patterns on the carpet. From time to time she heard the faint scuff of boots downstairs and the whisper of the clock striking the quarter hour. The air was heavy with lilac, that same too-sweet perfume pressing against the senses. It was some time after 3 when the stillness broke. A door slammed below, followed by hurried footsteps on gravel. Miss Marple rose instantly, slipping on her cardigan, and peered out. A figure was moving toward the garden, a lantern swinging wildly. The beam caught a flash of metal spade, perhaps, or something similar. She hesitated only long enough to fetch her torch before descending the stairs with remarkable quietness for one of her years. Outside, the mist hung low, thick as breath. The lilac hedge loomed pale and spectral, every blossom dripping with dew. The figure was bent over the soil again, digging feverishly near the place of the earlier discovery. Miss Marple's voice came, low and steady. "You'll find the ground no softer for guilt, my dear." The spade froze. Then the figure straightened, turning toward her young man's face, pale and frantic in the lantern light. "Tommy Pierce." "Miss Marple." "Toe didn't mean to please. What is it you didn't mean to do?" she asked gently. "I had to make sure," he stammered. "He said he'd put something here, something that would prove it wasn't her fault." "Who said so?" Tommy's mouth opened, but before he could answer, another sound cut through the mist, the faint click of a safety catch. A gun. Somewhere close. Miss Marple felt rather than see the movement, and pulled Tommy down beside her just as a shot rang out. The bullet struck the lilac branches, scattering petals in a sudden shower. "Run, boy!" she whispered. "To the house now." He fled, stumbling through the darkness, while Miss Marple crouched low among the scent and leaves. Silence followed, deep and deliberate. Whoever had fired was no panicked hand. A warning, not a miss. She waited, senses alert, until the faintest outline moved near the garden wall, a shadow retreating with calculated calm. By the time Constable Ames arrived with his lantern, breathless from the lane, Miss Marple was already at the gate. "It came from beyond the hedge," she told him. "We must search toward the orchard." They found only footprints and a discarded cartridge, glinting faintly in the grass. Ames muttered an oath. Professional, this one. Knows how to vanish. Miss Marple stooped to examine the shell casing. "Or how to distract," she murmured. "Noise can hide what silence reveals." They returned to the house to find Mrs. Bantry at the landing, white-faced in her dressing gown. "What on earth?" "Nothing to alarm you yet," Miss Marple said briskly, though it would be prudent to lock the doors. By dawn, the mist had thinned into a pale ribbon across the fields. Inspector Craddock arrived, weary-eyed from the night train, to find the household huddled in the drawing-room. Tommy Pierce sat apart, trembling. "It wasn't me, sir," he blurted the moment Craddock entered. "I didn't shoot. I only wanted to look." Craddock placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then tell me plainly what you meant to find." Tommy swallowed hard. "A note. The man from London said he'd left proof for me behind the lilacs. Said it'd clear Mrs. Partridge's name." "What man?" "Mr. Grayson. He gave me £50 to keep quiet about seeing him there the first time. But last night he said he'd been followed, that someone from the hall wanted her blamed." The inspector frowned, glancing toward Miss Marple. "And you believed him?" The old lady's eyes were serene. When one's young, belief often comes cheaper than truth. Craddock exhaled slowly. "And now Grayson's gone?" "Yes, sir," said Ames from the doorway. "Checked out an hour before dawn, left by motorcar, heading toward Melchester Road." Craddock's jaw tightened. "We'll have every patrol searching." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the window. Outside, the first sunlight touched the lilacs, washing them in pale gold. "He'll not get far," she said softly. "But when we find him, I fear it may be too late for one of our own." The inspector turned sharply. "You expect another death?" "I was told to," she replied, and her eyes flicked toward the mirror on the wallet's surface, now cracked through the center, as though the house itself had been listening. The crack in the mirror caught the dawn light like a wound. Miss Marple stood before it, her reflection divided neatly down the middle, two calm halves that did not quite meet. It seemed an apt image for St. Mary Mead that morning, a village still itself, yet fractured by something quietly unspoken. Inspector Craddock had taken charge with brisk authority. "We'll have to widen the search," he said, scanning his notes. "If Grayson's fled, he'll aim for the station at Melchester. I'll send word ahead." Mrs. Bantry, wrapped in a shawl, looked from one face to another. "You don't think he'll dare come back?" Miss Marple shook her head. "When one carries guilt, one seldom dares to stop. Movement feels like safety, though sometimes it's only a circle." Craddock glanced up. "And what do you make of the note, Miss Marple? Another death before dawn, was that mere bravado?" "Not quite," she said. "The writer had confidence, not bluster. He or she meant it, which makes the silence this morning rather curious. One sometimes fears the wrong death." They went together into the garden. The lilacs looked almost innocent now, washed by dew, their heavy scent drifting toward the hedgerow. Nothing moved except a thrush on the lawn, yet as they passed the hedge, Constable Ames called out, "Sir, over here by the path." The figure lay half hidden behind the lilac roots. It was Miss Ellery. Her dark coat was soaked through, the hem caked with earth. One gloved hand still clutched a small purse, the other rested open upon the ground, palm upward, as though pleading. The faint smell of cordite lingered in the air. Mrs. Bantry gave a choked cry. Oh, heavens! Miss Ellery! Craddock knelt, professional even in shock. No sign of struggle, he said quietly. Gunshot wound to the chest. Close range. The weapon's gone. Miss Marple, standing a pace behind, took in the scene with gentle precision, the angle of the fallen hat, the twisted strap of the handbag, the faint indentation in the damp grass where another person had knelt. She didn't expect to die here, she murmured. She came to meet someone she trusted. Craddock turned sharply. Trusted? After that warning? Miss Marple's expression softened. Oh, yes. People like Miss Ellery trust readily when the invitation flatters their sense of importance. Someone must have convinced her she held the key. The inspector straightened. You think she knew something about Mrs. Partridge? I think she believed she did, said Miss Marple, but belief and knowledge seldom sleep in the same bed. They carried the body to the library, away from curious eyes. Mrs. Bantry's servants whispered in the hall, their faces pale as milk. Gossip, Miss Marple thought, would already be weaving its next tapestry, 1 part fear, 2 parts invention. Craddock leaned against the mantel, weary. Every clue in this case seems to lead to another corpse. Life is consistent that way, she said mildly. Sin, once disturbed, tends to spread like smoke through curtains. He smiled faintly despite himself. And the letter warning us, it mentioned another death. Perhaps this was what it foretold. Or what it caused, said Miss Marple. Foreknowledge can be its own weapon. They examined the dead woman's purse. Inside were 2 letters bound with a ribbon. One bore the heading Marchmont Estate, 1918 old, folded many times. The second was unsigned, written in a bold, masculine hand. Craddock read aloud, I cannot live with the memory, but I cannot confess alone. Meet me at the hall garden before sunrise. Mrs. Bantry shuddered. She went thinking she could help. Miss Marple's eyes darkened. Perhaps, or thinking she could be seen helping. Appearances are a powerful narcotic. The inspector frowned. The handwriting matches the warning note delivered to you. Yes, said Miss Marple quietly. But the tone differs. The first was calculated. This one is almost penitent. It might have been dictated or imitated. Ames entered then, removing his cap. Sir, the villagers say they saw headlights near Rose Bank around 3 o'clock. I thought it was the milk lorry, but it turned toward the hall. Craddock nodded grimly. That settles it. Grayson came back. Possibly, said Miss Marple. Or someone wanted it to appear so. The inspector looked exasperated. You'd have me suspect half the county. I would have you suspect human nature, she said softly. It seldom acts alone. He gave a short laugh, rubbing his brow. And what do you suggest I do ask the Lilacs? They might tell you more than people will, Miss Marple replied. Plants rarely lie, Inspector. They simply grow where the truth is buried. As Craddock gave orders to his men, Miss Marple stood by the window, gazing at the mist clearing from the garden. The mirror across the room reflected the scene, once again, lilacs, sunlight, and, just visible between them, the faint glimmer of something metallic near the hedge. She stepped closer, her reflection following like a shadow. There, caught on the lower branch, hung a gold cufflink shaped like a crown. Not a woman's adornment. Not Grayson's either, she was almost certain. It belonged to someone who carried rank with ease and secrecy like perfume. She held it in her palm, the metal still warm from the early sun. Vanity, she murmured to herself, is the only thing more durable than guilt. Behind her, the clock struck 8. Outside, the village was waking, ready to dress its new tragedy in polite conversation. The village bell tolled 8, its slow notes rolling across the mist-silvered fields. Miss Marple remained at the window, turning the gold cufflink between her fingers. The engraved crown caught the sunlight, delicate yet unmistakable, the kind issued to officers during the war, and still occasionally worn by gentlemen who liked their past close at hand. She slipped it into her handkerchief, folding the cloth with care just as Inspector Craddock returned from the garden. "We've moved the body," he said quietly. "Dr. Hayward confirms it was instant." She never had the chance to cry out. He paused, studying Miss Marple's face. "You've found something?" "In a sense," she replied, holding out the handkerchief. "Something that doesn't belong to Miss Ellery or to the dead Mrs. Partridge." Craddock opened it and frowned. "A cufflink." "Military issue, possibly. Where did you go?" "Caught on the lilac hedge. I imagine it was torn loose when someone stooped to move the body." He turned it in his palm. "Crown insignia. There can't be many of these about. You think our elusive Mr. Grayson wore it?" "Unlikely. His hands were bare, I noticed, and his vanity expressed itself differently, signet rings, not symbols of service." "No, Inspector. This belonged to someone who wears respectability as armor." Mrs. Bantry, hovering in the doorway, gave a little gasp. "Colonel Marchmont. He's always got those dreadful gold cufflinks with his old regiment's crest." Craddock shot her a look of mild rebuke. "Let's not jump to conclusions, ma'am." But Miss Marple's eyes had softened, almost sorrowful. "No need to jump, Inspector. We may walk there in due course." They went together to Rosebank later that morning. The Marchmonts' house looked much as before immaculate, blind to scandal. Colonel Marchmont received them in his study, a large man whose moustache had outlived both fashion and innocence. He was all politeness until Craddock produced the cufflink. Then his face altered, just slightly, the veneer cracking like a porcelain glaze. "Good heavens," he said after a pause. "Yes, that's mine or was. Must have lost it days ago." "Possibly last night," said Craddock. "Near old Hall's garden." Marchmont's eyes flickered toward Miss Marple before settling on the inspector. "Ridiculous. I haven't set foot near that place in months." "Miss Ellery was found dead there," Craddock said evenly. "You were her employer. She left the house some time before 3. The colonel's color rose. "I had nothing to do with that poor woman's folly. She was unbalanced, prone to fantasies. My wife will tell you I was here all night." Mrs. Marchmont appeared in the doorway as if summoned by name, a thin woman with careful posture and eyes like shuttered windows. "Indeed he was," she said quietly. We retired shortly after midnight. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on her, on the tremor of her gloved hands, on the faint trace of soil along the hem of her skirt. "The night must have felt endless," she said gently. "I always find sleepless hours stretch like elastic." The woman flinched almost imperceptibly, then smiled. "Quiet, though we heard nothing until this morning." Craddock pocketed the cufflink. "We'll confirm your statements, of course. Thank you for your time." As they left the villa, Miss Marple paused by the gate. The beds along the path were newly turned, their soil darker than the rest of the garden. "Curious," she said softly. "Freshly dug this morning, by the look of it. Yet the Marchmonts have employed no gardener since Mrs. Partridge's death." Craddock followed her gaze. "You think something's buried here?" "Perhaps only regret," said Miss Marple. "But regret is seldom content to stay underground." They walked back toward the green. Villagers were already gathered near the post office, voices low, eyes bright with speculation. Mrs. Price Ridley was telling anyone who would listen that Miss Ellery's ghost had been seen near the hall gates at dawn. "Terrible omen," she whispered. "Means the killer's someone we all know." Miss Marple offered her a kind smile. "That's always the way, dear. We seldom import our sins. We cultivate them." By afternoon, the inspector had set his men to examine the Marchmont property discreetly. Meanwhile, Miss Marple visited the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement poured strong tea and murmured, "Do you think Colonel Marchmont is capable of murder, Jane?" "Capability is a broad word," Miss Marple replied. "I've yet to meet anyone truly incapable of it." "But why Miss Ellery? She was only a companion." "Companions are dangerous," said Miss Marple. "They see without being seen. A dangerous position in any household that has something to hide." Evening came with another hush of rain. The lilacs, heavy now with moisture, bowed toward the path as though in mourning. Miss Marple stood once more in her garden, listening to the faint echo of a motor in the distance. Craddock's men would return by nightfall, she knew. Answers seldom travelled faster than suspicion. Then, out of the quiet, came a soft knock at her gate. Tommy Pierce stood there, drenched and trembling. "Miss Marple," he whispered, "they've found something behind Rose Bank. A box small, metal, half buried." "What kind of box, Tommy?" "It looked like a biscuit tin, ma'am, but inside there's papers. Old letters, one with Mrs. Partridge's name on it and another with the Colonel's." She took his hand firmly. "Tell no one else." "Not yet." In the deepening dusk, the lilac scent thickened, clinging to her like memory. She looked toward the road leading to Rose Bank, where the mist was beginning to rise again, curling soft and silver against the hedges. Somewhere beneath that stillness, the truth was stirring, restless, inevitable, and perilously close to the surface. Mist moved like breath over the hedgerows as Miss Marple and Tommy reached Rose Bank. The vicar's bell had long fallen silent, yet the air seemed to carry its echo. The boy led her through the side gate to where the soil had been disturbed, a narrow trench beside the rose border, its edges glistening faintly under lamplight. The biscuit tin lay half exposed, the metal damp and mottled with age. "It was under the white roses, ma'am," Tommy whispered. "I thought at first it was rubbish, but the papers looked old, and the ink ran when I touched it." Miss Marple knelt carefully beside the hole, her eyes thoughtful. "White roses," she murmured. "So often planted in memory of something one prefers to forget." She brushed the earth from the tin and eased open the lid. Inside lay folded envelopes, their corners fused by dampness. The topmost bore Mrs. Partridge's careful script, the others, she noted, were addressed to Colonel Marchmont in the same hand. Craddock arrived moments later, summoned by Ames's bicycle messenger. He crouched beside her, lifting one letter with a gloved hand. "Good heavens," he muttered. "Postmarks from 1918. And this one, look here, on His Majesty's service." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "War leaves curious relics, Inspector. Not all of them are medals." The Colonel and his wife appeared soon after, their lanterns swinging like uneasy hearts. "What is the meaning of this?" Marchmont demanded, his voice more bluster than conviction. "Digging in my garden at this hour." "Your servant here discovered the box," said Craddock, standing. "We have reason to believe these letters concern Mrs. Partridge's death." Mrs. Marchmont stepped forward. "That woman again. Haven't we had enough of her shadow?" Her tone quivered between anger and fear. Miss Marple regarded her kindly. "Shadows do cling, my dear, especially when light falls suddenly where one least expects it." The Colonel's eyes darted to the box. "These letters are my private correspondence. I'll thank you to return them." "I'm afraid that won't be possible," said Craddock evenly. "They'll be examined. The law is quite firm on such matters." He carried the tin into the study, Miss Marple following quietly. The Colonel remained standing, fists clenched, as Craddock spread the letters across the desk. Several bore military crests, one sealed with red wax, had never been opened. Another, thinner and folded twice, carried faint traces of lilac-scented impossibility, and yet there it was. Craddock slit the unsealed one carefully. The handwriting within was unmistakably Mrs. Partridge's, precise, meticulous, and heavy with restraint. "Sir," I beg you to remember your promise. The boy was innocent. The theft was not his doing. I took the blame to spare the regiment's name. You swore to see I would not want work or roof. I have kept silent these 20 years. I cannot do so much longer. The inspector laid it down with a sigh. Blackmail, perhaps. Or conscience. Miss Marple shook her head. No, confession. And perhaps an appeal for justice from one whose loyalty had been misused. The colonel's voice was harsh. You don't understand. It was a wartime thing. Indeed, said Miss Marple gently. Yet some mistakes grow roots, Colonel. Yours seem to have flowered rather vividly. His wife's composure broke then. I told you it would come back, she whispered. I told you she'd never stay quiet forever. He turned on her sharply, but Miss Marple's voice cut through, calm and clear. Mrs. Marchmont, you've been carrying a heavier burden than your husband, I think. It was you who met Miss Ellery in the garden, wasn't it? The woman froze. I only wanted to stop her. She said she'd seen the letters, and that she'd tell the police. I went to reason with her. And the revolver? Craddock asked quietly. She pressed her gloved hands together. I took it from the desk, for protection only, but she laughed and said women like me always hid behind men's crimes. Then she grabbed my wrist. It went off. The colonel covered his face with both hands, the sound of his breath filling the room. Saba, my God, he muttered. Edith, why didn't you come to me? Miss Marple's gaze rested on them both, sorrow more than judgment in her expression. Because she knew what you'd already done in her name, Colonel. Silence protects respectability, but it rarely protects the innocent. Craddock spoke gently. You'll make a statement, madam. I'll do what I can to keep it decent. Mrs. Marchmont nodded faintly, tears tracking through her powder. It's strange, she said. I thought if I buried the letters, the past would sleep. But the flowers every spring grow too well, as if she were still tending them. Miss Marple folded her hands. The dead are seldom content when wronged, my dear. They make themselves known through whatever grows nearest. Outside, the first stir of dawn paled the sky to grey. Craddock closed the tin, and the colonel sank into his chair, head bowed. The lilac scent drifted faintly through the open window, mingling with the fragrance of wet roses. As Miss Marple stepped out into the garden, Tommy waited at the gate. Is it over, ma'am? He asked softly. She looked toward the lilac hedge, luminous in the new light. Over for some, perhaps, she said, but not for the village. It will talk and speculate and smooth its conscience with sympathy. That's how we bury things here under words. The boy glanced up at her, uncertain. Will they forgive her? Miss Marple's smile was wistful. Forgiveness is a flower that grows slowly, Tommy. But it does grow if the soil is honest. A breeze stirred the branches, scattering pale petals across the grass, like the faintest fall of snow. One landed on Miss Marple's sleeve. She brushed it away gently, then turned toward the road home, where the morning light was rising soft and gold, and the scent of lilacs lingered like a memory that refused to fade. The road to St. Mary Mead glowed faintly beneath the new sunlight, glistening after the night's mist. Miss Marple walked home at an unhurried pace, her shoes damp from the dew. Behind her, Rosebank's windows were shuttered, the Marchmonts' tragedy already closing itself behind drawn curtains and polite whispers. The village would be up soon, she thought, baking bread, boiling kettles, feeding chickens, and yet something intangible had shifted. Respectability had been bruised, and like a rose stem bent in the wind, it would take time to stand straight again. At her gate, she paused. The lilacs that framed her own garden looked innocent enough, their fragrance soft and clean, but Miss Marple caught herself inhaling warily, as though scent itself might conceal deceit. She entered the cottage quietly and set the kettle on the stove, letting the silence steady her. It was an old silence, one that knew grief, gossip, and the faint rustle of life rearranging itself after scandal. By mid-morning, Mrs. Clement arrived, breathless, with her shawl askew and moral outrage trembling just beneath her gentility. "Jane, have you heard of it? They've taken Mrs. Marchmont away to Melchester for questioning. Leonard says it's only procedural, but people are already saying dreadful things." Miss Marple poured her friend a cup of tea. "People will always say dreadful things, my dear. It saves them from the discomfort of pity." Mrs. Clement sank into a chair. Still, one can hardly credit it. Imagine a colonel's wife. And Miss Ellery, of all people, caught up in it. It's like something out of a book. "Human nature," said Miss Marple mildly, "is often less original than it supposes. We repeat our mistakes with far greater consistency than our virtues." The vicar's wife sighed, pressing her hands together. "I keep thinking of Mrs. Partridge, how alone she must have been, knowing what she did. No one would have believed her, not against people like the Marchmonts." Miss Marple's eyes rested briefly on the window, where sunlight struck the glass. "Belief is rather like glass, my dear transparent, until something cracks it. Then everyone notices what was always there." Mrs. Clement looked at her with curiosity. "You speak as though you knew her well." "Not well," Miss Marple admitted, "but long enough to see the sort of woman she was. The sort who covers pain with order. She dusted away what hurt her, one corner at a time." At that moment, Constable Ames appeared at the gate. He removed his cap awkwardly as Miss Marple stepped outside. "Beg pardon, ma'am, but Inspector Craddock thought you might like to know they found the rest of the ledger pages. Hidden in the Marchmont study chimney. Scorched round the edges, but readable. It proves Mrs. Partridge took the blame for a wartime theft trust supplies sold off for private gain. The Colonel signed off the accounts." Miss Marple's lips pressed together, neither surprised nor triumphant. "I rather thought the truth would tidy itself eventually," she said. "It's what truth does when left alone long enough." Ames nodded. "Inspector says it'll go easier on the lady. What with her confession? She'll likely face trial, but, well, they don't hang for accidents anymore." "No," said Miss Marple softly. "We only hang in reputation these days. The rope's invisible, but it holds just as tight." When Ames departed, she returned inside to find Mrs. Clement gaze thoughtfully into her teacup. "I can't decide whether I feel sorry for her," she said. "Mrs. Marchmont, I mean, or for her husband." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "You may safely do both, my dear. Pity costs nothing, and we seldom spend it where it's undeserved." The kettle whistled softly between them, filling the space with a small, homely sound, the kind that made tragedy seem indecently far away. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked once more through the village. The news had ripened already, and it had changed shape. In the post office, Mrs. Weatherby assured everyone that Mrs. Marchmont had confessed to defending herself from a blackmailer. At the grocer's, Miss Hartnell declared it was the Colonel himself who had fired the shot, only allowing his wife to take the blame out of misplaced chivalry. Near the church, Mr. Archer murmured that he'd heard the whole business stemmed from a secret love affair. The facts, Miss Marple reflected, would now be embalmed in gossip, each retelling trimming the rough edges until it fit comfortably into the village conscience. She stopped near the churchyard, where the lilacs bordering the old stone wall had begun to fade. There she found Tommy Pierce sitting on a bench, his cap in his hands. "Is it really over, Miss Marple?" he asked quietly. "They say they're taking her away tomorrow. Insofar as such things end," she said. "But time will finish what the law begins. And you, Tommy, you've done well to be brave. It isn't easy seeing grown-up wickedness up close." He looked down. "I keep thinking maybe Mrs. Partridge would be glad about the truth coming out." "She would," Miss Marple said softly. "But I expect she'd also worry whether the silver was polished properly for Sunday. Women like that seldom rest, even in peace." They sat in companionable silence until the church bell chimed the hour. Miss Marple rose and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Do something kind today," she said. "That's the best way to put the world back in order." As she continued home, she saw Mrs. Bantry waving from her motor car, a basket of lilies in the back seat. "Off to decorate the church," she called cheerfully. "I thought we could do something bright." "Indeed," said Miss Marple with a smile. "A bit of beauty never goes amiss after ugliness." That evening she returned to her cottage, drew the curtains, and sat by the window with her knitting. The village beyond glowed softly under the lamplight, the air full of quiet domestic noises, the clink of dishes, a dog barking, the distant hum of conversation. Respectability, she thought, was busily repairing itself, stitching over the tear as neatly as one might mend a lace cuff. On the mantel lay a single lilac bloom, its petals beginning to curl. She had taken it that morning from the hedge by the hall, intending to throw it out, but finding herself unable to. The fragrance lingered faintly, neither pleasant nor unpleasant, just persistent, like memory. She threaded her needle, listening to the rhythm of the clock. Every tick seemed to settle the village further back into its habits. Scandal became a story, sorrow became an anecdote. The garden outside rustled in the wind, a softer, cleaner sound now that the season was turning. Miss Marple looked toward the window once more. "Peace," she murmured, "has a talent for looking like forgetfulness." Then she smiled to herself, just a small wry curve of the lips. "But the lilacs," she added, "will remember." And in the stillness of the room, the scent of them lingered sweet, haunting, and entirely unforgiving. The following Sunday dawned bright and temperate, a gentler sort of morning than the village deserved. Church bells rang clearly through the air, washing away for a few brief hours the residue of talk that still clung to every doorstep. St. Mary Mead, in its way, was already practicing collective amnesia, a ritual not unlike prayer. Yet beneath the surface, something unspoken lingered, like the perfume of flowers one cannot quite forget. Miss Marple attended service as she always did, sitting quietly near the rear pew where she could observe the congregation without appearing to. The Marchmont pew stood empty, a vacancy that hummed with speculation. Mrs. Bantry whispered to the vicar's wife that the colonel had gone to stay with cousins near Bath. The vicar, poor man, gave a sermon on forgiveness that wandered uncertainly between theology and gossip. Miss Marple listened, eyes serene, though her mind worked on a different rhythm altogether. When the service ended, she stepped out into the churchyard, where sunlight filtered through the lilac branches by the boundary wall. The blossoms were beginning to brown now, their fragrance sharper, almost bitter. Mrs. Price Ridley was waiting by the gate, brimming with moral satisfaction. "Terrible business, Jane," she said, "though I suppose one must pity her, a woman driven beyond endurance." "Endurance," said Miss Marple mildly, "is a matter of what one chooses to endure. Some bear guilt with more grace than truth." The woman blinked, unsure whether to agree or be offended, and soon found an excuse to turn away. Miss Marple remained, studying the lilacs a moment longer. Each cluster seemed heavy with the season's end, and yet within the wilt there was renewed the tight green buds already forming beneath the decay. She smiled faintly at that small insistence of life. Back at her cottage, she found Inspector Craddock waiting on the garden path, his hat in his hands, the brim turning slowly between his fingers. "Thought I'd drop by before heading back to Melchester," he said. "The Marchmont affairs finished for now." The wife confessed, the husband resigned to his ruin. "And you, Miss Marple, seem remarkably unsurprised." She gestured toward the bench beneath her window. "You've learned, Inspector, that surprise is a luxury I cannot afford." He laughed softly. "True enough. Still, I can't quite see how you pieced it all together before we did." "Oh, it wasn't difficult," she said, settling into her chair. When one observes long enough, patterns become their own confession. A woman who plants white roses over guilt. A man who hides behind his medals. A companion who believes morality is gossip. And of course, a village that prefers beauty to truth. He looked at her curiously. "You speak as though you disapprove." "Not at all," Miss Marple replied, her smile faint and wistful. "It's what keeps the world orderly. We tidy our wickedness beneath the laced doilies and hymn books, and call the result civilization." Craddock leaned back, his expression softening. "I dare say you'd have made a fine detective, Miss Marple." She poured him a cup of tea. "My dear Inspector, I'm a detective, only I detect in smaller drawing rooms." He chuckled, raising the cup in salute. "To small rooms, then." "To small truths," she corrected, "which are so often the beginning of large ones." After he had gone, the afternoon unfolded in a hush. Bees moved lazily among the lavender, and the air shimmered faintly with heat. Miss Marple took her embroidery from its basket, but found herself pausing between stitches, thinking of Mrs. Marchmont in her cell pail, composed, already halfway to legend. Guilt, she reflected, was a curious garment. Some wore it like a shroud, others like a uniform, both concealed and proclaimed. A knock at the gate broke her reverie. It was young Tommy Pierce again, awkward but earnest, holding a small posy of lilacs. "For you, Miss Marple," he said shyly. "They're the last of the season." "How very kind," she replied, accepting them, "though you know, Tommy, lilacs never quite die. Their roots run deeper than most suppose." He nodded solemnly, though it was clear he didn't entirely understand. "Mum says the village is back to normal now." "Normal," said Miss Marple gently, "is simply what we call things once we've stopped looking closely." She watched him walk away, the sun glinting on his hair, and thought of how youth forgets so easily. Then she placed the lilacs in a glass vase by the window, where their fading color caught the light. Outside, the lanes shimmered with a quiet, drowsy peace. Even scandal, it seemed, could not survive long under such gentle weather. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, a cup of tea cooling beside her. The air held that strange stillness that follows revelation, a silence that feels both relief and melancholy. She took out her notebook, where she had written small fragments over the past days. Lilacs, bloomed too early. Footprints by hedge. Guilt flowering beneath respectability. She read the words, then closed the book. "Another season over," she murmured to the room. "Another tidy ending." Yet, as she looked toward the window, she saw one lilac branch still stirring against the fading sky. Its petals trembled, their scent faint but lingering, and Miss Marple smiled a small, knowing smile that carried both sorrow and serenity. "For all their prettiness," she said softly, "they do have a most inconvenient habit of returning." The clock struck 8, and the fire settled into embers. Beyond the garden wall, the village exhaled, its peace restored, its conscience soothed. And within her quiet cottage, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, threading order from chaos once more, while the lilacs outside kept their silent, fragrant watch over all that St. Mary Mead preferred to forget.